Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning and good evening to everyone. My name is Indrani Sarkar, and I work as a child protection specialist in UNICEF Middle East and North Africa Regional Office. And I'm quite happy that today I'm joined with our colleagues from UNFPA Arab States Regional Office as co-hosts for this meeting. So I'd like to say a big thank you to all of you who have joined us today from different parts of the world. And I'm sure I can see that some of you have joined us right on time, and we're still waiting for some more colleagues to join. And I'm so happy that we are able to commemorate the International Day of Zero Tolerance for FGM together. We are extremely pleased that the theme in 2023 is focusing on partnering with men and boys to transform social and gender norms to end FGM. But before we begin this webinar today, I'd just like to share some housekeeping information. We have interpretation facilities in Arabic and French. Please click the globe symbol on the bottom right-hand side to choose your preferred language channel and mute the original audio channel. Also, please feel free to introduce yourself on the chat box, and throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A section. Moving on to today's webinar, just wanted to highlight that we all know that family honor and social expectations play a powerful role in perpetuating FGM, making it extremely difficult for individual families as well as individual girls and women to stop the practice on their own. A lot of our community level FGM interventions have often focused on interactions and raising awareness among mothers, grandmothers, and girls themselves. Even though often we see that FGM is sort of considered women's issue, we know that it's more than just that. We know that men contribute explicitly or tactically by consenting to the perpetuation of the practice in their families and communities. And indeed, they can play a role as partners with women and girls to change the normative dialogue and practice around women's bodily autonomy and their rights. However, their potential influence in ending FGM has not been fully realized. And today's webinar will reflect on men's own perceptions on masculinities, as well as how men and boys can be holistically engaged in our efforts to end FGM. While some of our findings and discussions today will focus on the Arab states and MENA region, we know that this would be applicable for various other settings where you all work. So without further ado, we will now like to start today's webinar. It's our great pleasure to welcome Adel Kodre, for our Regional Director of UNICEF MENARO, to share her opening remarks for this webinar. Over to you, Adel. Thank you so much for joining us so early in New York.
Thank you so much, and I hope you can hear me well. I'm sorry, I have a cold.
Yes, we can.
New York was at -15 on Saturday, so it hit me hard. But I really have the pleasure to be here with you and to talk about this subject, which is so dear to my heart for different reasons. Because in fact, I worked in child protection in Sudan many years ago, and FGM was, of course, the Salima initiative was launched shortly after I had left, but the team there had been working on it. And I'm also happy to be here with the colleagues from UNFPA, because certainly I believe in the value of interagency work, and I work very well with my colleague in UNFPA, especially Leila. But a few points perhaps at the beginning. For us and for you all, of course, female genital mutilation is one of the manifestations of gender-based human rights violations. And it represents really the control of society over women, their sexuality, their body, their autonomy as a human being. It is a form of gender inequality that remains deeply entrenched in the social and economic structures of the communities and the societies where it is practiced. Partnering with boys and men in gender equality is crucial for ending harmful practices such as FGM. By adopting a gender transformative approach that promotes both the empowerment of girls and women, and men adopting positive masculinities. and issues related to marriage, who they will marry in some communities, are very much linked to FGM. So it is critical to engage men and boys and their communities to shift attitudes and behaviors towards FGM, which ultimately aims to control, as we said, women's sexuality, their bodies and autonomy. The position of power that men and boys have within homes, community, and larger society, they can play an important role in changing the narrative. One of the main reasons that the girls are cut, other than controlling their sexuality, is also to make them suitable for the marriage market in many communities, which connects back to the role of the men and the boys and the fathers as well for saying no to the practice. There is an increasing recognition of the importance of working with men and boys in this regard, and there are community-level interventions that focus on elimination of FGM through discussion with girls, mothers, and especially grandmothers on the negative impact of the practice, the girls' empowerment and access to services. However, a more holistic approach that ensures a safe and conducive environment for girls needs to work with men and boys to address the discriminatory gender norms that sustain this practice. Ending patriarchy and challenging restrictive gender norms is not the only responsibility of girls and women. Engaging boys and men in comprehensive and coordinated responses requires that recognition is fostered of harmful forms of masculinities and solutions identified and implemented to redress them. It is critical to ensure that our programming creatively engages boys and men with methodologies that support them to question and recognize issues of masculinity that are harmful for themselves and their relationships, as well as their privilege and the power they exert in society. Programming should support men and boys in recognizing and using their power and privilege to further the interests of women and girls, while simultaneously transforming masculinities and practicing accountability towards women and girls. So today, I'm really happy to invite you to this webinar to launch the programming guidance promoting men and boys engagement in ending FGM in MENA, developed by UNICEF in collaboration with Equimondo. This programming guidance has been developed under the framework of the UNFPA-UNICEF joint program on the elimination of FGM, and we are very happy to co-launch this with UNFPA Arab States Regional Bureau. Together, we are stronger. I definitely believe in that. I hope you will all find this programming guidance useful and be able to use it and use its recommendation in programming and key messages to holistically engage men and boys as partners in our joint efforts to end FGM. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adele, for really your important insights, and also stressing that challenging restrictive norms is not the sole responsibility of girls and women only, but also the critical role that men and boys can play. And with this, now we move into the exciting discussion that we have with different panel members today on different perspectives on engaging men and boys. And I'd like to invite our first panel member, Jose Roberto, gender expert with UNFPA. Welcome, Jose. We would like to hear your perspectives on why you think from your work, why is it important for us to promote positive masculinity in different areas of the work? And why is it critical not just for the UN, but also for the overall gender equality agenda more broadly? Over to you, Jose.
Thank you, Indrani, and thank you everyone for this opportunity of being here discussing about positive masculinities. Of what do we mean when we talk about masculinity, or sometimes in plural masculinities? And I'm really happy to see how this joint collaboration can really put this conversation forward for this region. where, you know, like the conversation around not only engaging men and boys, but beyond that, promoting positive and healthy masculinities is really urgent. We have seen how this region is facing not only harmful practices like FGM or child marriage, but how, for example, gender-based violence is highly prevalent. And that means that, you know, like as a society, we accept, we normalize, you know, like this issue that is affecting everyone, because when it comes to all these patriarchal norms, are not only women and girls who are affected, it's the society as a whole. So what do we mean, you know, like when we're talking about masculinity or masculinities, we are really talking about all these social expectations of being a man, but not only the social expectations or the mandates that are expected from men and boys. It's also how the society is really trying to shape one form of masculinity, which is very often dominant and harmful. And this is what we are trying to not only unpack, but challenge. And, you know, like, I really like this element that, for example, like Quimundo has, you know, like brought to us coming from the man box study. And it's this notion about the man box, how these social construction of masculinities are really calling, you know, like men to perform certain behaviors, attitudes, forms, expressions, decision making, how we exercise power. And, you know, like you can see on the slide, you know, like these 7 characteristics, you know, like how men are called to be or pretend to be self-sufficient, how we are, you know, like called to be acting tough, how, you know, like all the physical attractiveness, but also expressing rigid, you know, like masculine gender roles, norms, how this mandate about heterosexuality, but from a very discriminatory perspective, how hypersexualized, you know, like the human being, or, you know, like this human self of being a man, and how aggression and control is also part of all these collection and mandates. And of course, when it comes to talking about the elimination of FGM, you know, like what all the elements about the control of sexuality and females' bodies in particular and lives are crossing across. And when we talk about, for example, there are many terms about masculinity. And of course, you know, like some of them are more accepted or not, you know, like some terms are contested, but beyond trying to be very theoretical, we have, for example, this very famous term about hegemonic masculinity, which is trying to say there is a mandate to perform, for example, a real way to be considered a man. And unfortunately, this dominant way of understanding masculinity is very often, you know, like trying to put all men in the same box, you know, like trying to perform the same way of being a man. But unfortunately, this mandate is really looking for, you know, like the patriarchal notions of masculinity or understanding ourselves as men. And this idea of, you know, like how masculinities or the ideas of, you know, and mandates around being a man are crossing not only how we learn to be a man, you know, like through the socialization process, but how our practices are also, you know, like part of this, you know, like a spectrum of mandates, but also how the social structures are also leading everything we do, we feel, we think in that way. And also for those who are not necessarily happy with this way of, you know, like being a man, are going to have also consequences, are going to have, you know, like either discrimination, you know, like how your peers are pushing you to come back to that. It's like the whole system will be pushing men to, you know, like to perform or to attach to that form of masculinities. And hearing from you have at least, you know, like 3 main categories. And I would like to revisit the hegemonic masculinity that I was explaining about, the toxic masculinity, which is more, you know, like a term used in the media. However, there is a lot of criticism as well, because, for example, when we are talking to boys, you know, like this term can also lead to certain negative aspects. But what we are really looking for is how we can really promote positive masculinities or healthy masculinities that can really be able to promote not only positive behaviors, but, you know, like more human ways to be a man. And of course, challenging the discriminatory gender norms and also, you know, like how men can really be these partners as this conversation is really convening. I'm not going to go through this slide that we have here, but in a nutshell, I would say that, for example, we have implemented so far, together with UNICEF, this global, the global program to end child marriage. We have been implementing, for example, the global a gender transformative accelerator tool. And what we have seen is most of the countries are really talking about engaging men and boys. But when it comes to really challenge power dynamics, you know, like power relations, how we can really transform discriminatory gender norms, redistribute power and resources, and also challenge these notions of masculinity based on, you know, like all this range of inequalities, the conversation is different. So we really need to move from this engagement perspective to promoting positive masculinities, and that will definitely move us to addressing GBV, to challenge harmful practices, and to promote positive ways of, you know, like being a man. And that includes, for example, the role of fathers through parenting programs, and we have evidence about these programs. I will stop there and thank you, colleagues, because I know that you have a lot to say, you know, like particularly for the MENA region through this process that you have been working on. Thank you, Indrani, and thank you, colleagues.
Thanks so much, Jose, for throwing some light on the different aspects of masculinities, but also stressing on the importance of how positive masculinity can also support in addressing a lot of harmful practices, GBV, as well as on parenting work that we all different organizations are working on. And this sort of gives us a good segue to our next presentation, which is actually a recorded message from Brian Hillman, who's the Senior Research Officer at Equimundo. And he will be sharing with us some key findings from the Images MENA study to set the context from this region on men's perceptions as well as their role that they can play in prevention of harmful practices. So if we can just quickly play the presentation that has been shared by Brian.
To be there with you live and in person, but I'm here. Hello, everyone. It's Brian Heilman here, a Senior Research Officer from Equimundo. I'm sorry not to be there with you live and in person, but I'm here to very briefly give you an introduction to our International Men and Gender Equality Survey findings with a specific focus on the Arab States region, and hope that this can set up the conversation for today to be a success. The International Men and Gender Equality Survey, or IMAGES for short, is really one of the only studies of its kind where in over 50 countries at this point we've asked men and women alike for their opinions about a whole range of gender attitudes, and then linked those attitudes and beliefs to various outcomes related to health and to violence and other important topics. That includes a sample of over 100,000 respondents by this point. As you can see, this study has been underway for over 10 years. The dates here listed are when the report in a certain country came out, and I want to direct your attention specifically to the years 2017, 2018, which is where we really started picking up our focus on the Arab States region, and it's mostly those data points that I'll be sharing with you today. You can see in 2017, Egypt, Lebanon, Morocco, Palestine, also in 2018, Kuwait. And more recently, we finished the study in Jordan and in Tunisia. However, those data will not be available for this presentation quite yet. For the full report and the richness of findings from the first 4 of those countries, I really urge you to visit the website imagesmena.org, where you can download the full 4-country report and see, you know, very deep details about the topics of interest to the study. But today, I really only have time for 3 fast headlines. The first of which is that Images teaches us that, of course, when talking about gender, we're really talking about power and abuses of power, and how power is controlled, how power and control are contested and wielded among men and women. And one of the harshest forms, of course, of men's use of power over women is their perpetration of intimate partner violence, This table here shows the prevalence rates of various forms of violence that we were able to measure in the study, where the yellow triangles at the top reflect any form of violence, the blue squares reflect emotional or psychological violence, the orange squares reflect physical violence, and the orange dots reflect sexual violence. So you can see diverse rates across the 5 countries in the region, but still certainly with many countries up above 50, 60% of the overall prevalence rate, this remains a very high urgent priority for us in the region. But of course, power and control are wielded in the home in the case of decision-making as well. And this is a slide that shows the proportion of respondents, both men and women, who told us that, or basically who responded about who has the final say with regard to large financial decisions in their home. And you don't need to really get concerned with the numbers, but if the respondent told us that it was primarily a man who makes the final decision about financial matters, those proportions are reflected by blue. If they told us that mostly in their current home this is shared equally, those responses are represented by a red. And if there were any cases where a woman primarily makes that decision, those are reflected by yellow. And so you can really see from a distance very clearly how there's so much more blue than pretty much any other color, certainly more blue than yellow. Although, of course, we're encouraged to see a fair amount of countries in that middle ground of sharing those decisions equally. We also see, and this is important to set ourselves up for today's conversation, just how lasting, how enduring the rigid ideas about gender norms and roles are in the region and truly worldwide. Images has dozens and dozens of nuanced statements about gender that we're asking folks to agree or disagree with. For today, just take a look at 3. Those relate to power, roles, and violence. A man should have the final word about decisions in his home, similar to what I just showed. A woman's most important role is to take care of her home and cook for her family, rigid roles of gender. And approving violence. A woman should tolerate violence in order to keep her family together. These all reflect a very harsh view of gender. And in the triangle image, you can see that power, roles, and violence, these 3 statements each are represented by one corner of the triangle. And the bigger that the triangle for each country is, into that corner shows a larger proportion of men in that country who agree with that idea. And so across the Arab states region, we see pretty big triangles, basically, that there is quite a lot of agreement with these ideas still, and that leaves us a lot of work to be done. Now, what we wanted also to look at is whether those ideas are changing across time, whether younger people maybe have more positive, more open-minded attitudes than the older generations. And this graphic, though admittedly messy, shows us that that's actually not the case. If we would have seen that younger respondents have much, much more open-minded views about gender, then all of these lines would have gone from the very bottom on the left-hand side in the oldest age groups all the way up to the very top, where a higher number reflects a more positive view of those gender statements. But instead, we see a big mess. And basically, when we combine all the countries available, including those in the Arab states, you see this dotted line right through the middle, which is basically just a flat line. And we don't see statistically significant differences between that oldest generation and the youngest generation of men in this case, though the figure is quite similar for women. So we certainly can't just sit back and expect that the younger generation will inevitably hold more equitable views. Third and finally, we really emphasize the intergenerational transmission and influence that's so strong in these cases, that men and women learn how to believe about gender, how to behave, often by witnessing their parents. And so influences in the childhood home are often among the most influential and strongest that shape your views and your behaviors. And of course, the strongest evidence of this relates to what is called the intergenerational transmission of violence, in this case, intimate partner violence. And in this chart, basically, you see the blue, the y-axis, so how high the bars are, is which proportion of that group told us that they have ever used intimate partner violence themselves. These are among men. And The red bars are, so the blue bars are those who have used violence against their partner, but who witnessed violence in their own childhood home, whereas the red bars are those who did not witness violence in their childhood home. So you can see how the red bars in every case are lower than the blue, indicating that there's a very strong relationship between violence that you witnessed growing up and your propensity to perpetrate that violence as an adult yourself. So very quickly, I know this is all the time that I had, and in fact, I've probably gone over by a minute, but these are the three main headlines I wanted to introduce. I hope throughout the course of the day, you can continue to think about how power is at the root of an issue like FGM, how the attitudes that shape this are proving very resistant to change, and also those links across generations that maybe we should be looking at in order to prevent and respond to this violence more. I'll send the presentation file to the organizers so you can access it and see these links to find more information. But I really thank you for your attention and the opportunity today, and good luck with the rest of the meeting. Thank you.
We thank Brian so much for sharing, giving us a quick snapshot of the images survey. And I have shared on the chat box the link to the images MENA survey, and we will also be sharing this presentation as well as the link in our post-webinar package. And finally, I would now like to invite Margaret Green, who is the Senior Fellow in Equimundo, and Amel Fahmi, who's the founder of the Bean Center for Gender Studies and also the project lead for this study, this programmatic guidance that was developed by UNICEF in Equimundo. And they will share with us a few findings from the qualitative research conducted in Djibouti, Egypt, Sudan, and Yemen, and some of the key recommendations for programming and messages to engage men and boys more holistically as partners in the efforts to eliminate FGM. We focus specifically on the MENA region now. Over to you, Meg and Amel.
Great, thank you. Let me share my screen. And Amel, I thought I would start, and then we could, but obviously, you know, come in at any moment. So it was wonderful to work with Amel. I'm a researcher based in Washington, D.C., and she's a very, distinguished researcher and advocate, and deeply involved in the issue of FGM and based in Cairo. And Equimundo has worked for many years on positive masculinities, and it was a great pleasure collaborating with UNICEF on bringing this perspective into this project. The research team was quite large. We had Dr. Amel and me, and then country consultants, and with the guidance of Indrani Sarkar and our colleague Dr. Giovanna Lauro at Equimundo. The country consultants were very deeply involved in collecting the qualitative data that is the centerpiece of this study. What we were focused on was what could be done to engage boys and men more fully in FGM prevention efforts, with the recognition that so many FGM prevention programs have focused very much on changing women's views and women's behaviors, and yet in a system of values and norms, everybody upholds those norms, or everybody participates in them in different ways. And so it's extremely important to engage boys and men, and as we've heard from the previous speakers. And then thinking about how research from these 4 specific settings, Yemen, Sudan, Egypt, and Djibouti, could guide the development of programmatic recommendations for the region more broadly. Were there some themes that would come up that would be relevant? So as others have said already, that FGM is often seen as women's business, but because it's motivated by gender inequality, and it is a form of sort of realizing some aspects of masculinity in a way that it's very important to engage men and boys, that it's excessive pressure and responsibility on women's shoulders to view them as primary, as the only ones responsible for ending FGM and the importance of engaging everybody in society. And then this opportunity to address a broader set of issues around masculinity with FGM as one aspect. And Amel, please chime in with at any moment. So the methodology of our study was qualitative research, and of course, qualitative research is quite difficult to summarize and present in a presentation like this. I was feeling envious of Brian Heilman. It's great when you can have a single visual and that captures it all. But the country consultants work to conduct individual in-depth interviews with key informants, so different family members, local leaders, teachers, religious leaders, and so on. And then also participatory focus group research. And then, of course, those interviews were structured and set up by our review of the literature and the published quantitative data, and looking at programs that have been implemented across the region. So just to now, are you able to see, or is the slide blocked at all by the picture, by the images of who is on the Zoom call?
No, we can see the Egypt
You
slide
can,
now.
okay, perfect. That's great. Great. Well, Egypt has been working on FGM for a very long time, and some changes can indeed be seen. You see some increased engagement in domestic roles among men, but these vary by the presence of other family members who might judge them, the views in their communities, and so on. Egypt shows how it's possible to bring FGM into more neutral ground, away from strictly religious rationales. Doctors are extremely influential in Egypt, and there's an opportunity to work with that influence, and certainly and not to get away from medicalization. And one really interesting opportunity is that ideas about women's bodily integrity and consent are increasingly part of people's awareness and discourse in Egypt, and they could be used, these ideas could be used in the fight against FGM. In addition, because of the long years of work on FGM, it's no longer taboo, in the sense that people are much more able to speak about it compared to some of the other settings. And the issue of sexuality is front and center, again, in this move away from religious reasons for FGM. One of the problems for programming is that the messages directed to men are often developed by and delivered by younger men who don't have the social influence that is needed to engage with older men. And then finally, a challenge in Egypt is that people have been talking about FGM over many years, and so there's a fatigue of hearing about the messages, and a need to develop fresh communications on the topic. In Djibouti, some of the key findings are that there is a shift from the practice of infibulation to what is being called sunnah, and with concern about the potential medicalization of the practice. That religion is a huge part of the discourse in Djibouti, and being invoked by men when they are interviewed to talk about FGM. Women are the primary decision makers on FGM, but men can play a very influential role. And if they do not want FGM to occur, it is not likely to happen. And so, there's a real opportunity to work with men, and they could really make a difference. Although they contribute to FGM financially, the practice itself occurs either in secret or sometimes when they are away, which is a challenge. Increasingly, men in Djibouti are questioning FGM, but are not working actively to end it. And so here again, it's an opportunity to provide ideas about how to engage with the issue. The one challenge, and not only in Djibouti, is that FGM is viewed as a women's issue, and so then that makes it harder to get men thinking and talking about it. And finally, again, in several of the settings in which we collected data, the anti-FGM activities are directed at communities in general, rather than kind of segmented and specifically focused on men with messages that would appeal to them particularly. In Sudan, decision-making is less, strictly sort of one group, just women or just men. So there's more, potentially more openness, more discussion, and men could play a role. One challenge is the stigma for men of becoming involved in what is seen as women's issues. But because of the greater discussion around, because of the dynamism, because the decision-making does not rest only with one group, they could potentially be influential in opposing the pressures to circumcise their daughters. And of course, there's always a generational challenge where in this case, where if grandmothers are important gatekeepers, then it's difficult for younger men who are interested in seeing the practice change to challenge them. The Salima campaign invoked earlier has been a very strong campaign. Indeed, it's sort of a global model for important work in this area, yet there could be additional, further tailoring to target men. And I'll talk a little bit about how that might happen in a moment. Again, many medical doctors, medical personnel are opposed to the practice, but they're not being recruited to combat it yet. And what's happened is that the way that medical messages are being conveyed, which is basically have led to a shift from infibulation towards what is being known as Sunnah. In Yemen is sort of in contrast with Egypt. Yemen is at the start of its journey to end FGM, and comparatively little has happened in Yemen. In Yemen, FGM is most often practiced on infants, potentially, with an opportunity to engage men as fathers and to work with the maternal and child health system at that stage. There's quite, the traditionalism around gender roles and power relations is quite solid, but there are some small shifts, and an important dimension of masculinity is the need to curb female sexuality. So this is how it's being how FGM, this is the key relationship between men, how they see themselves, and the practice of FGM. it's very difficult to discuss FGM in Yemen, and that obviously makes it harder to promote conversations where people can challenge the practice. Here again, it's considered a women's issue and religious reasons are invoked. The medical support for what people are calling Sunnah is of concern, and men themselves also view Sunnah as harmless. And current anti-FGM messages in Yemen are not really addressing men as they could. So what do some of these country-specific findings tell us about some of the overarching themes in the region and recommendations? As we've seen before, it's just, you cannot have strong gender transformative programming without engaging men. Gender transformative programming really is essentially requires the synchronization of messages for women and girls and men and boys. The messaging could be stronger and more strategic and directed in many of the settings. Medicalization is an issue, and also the difficulty of simply discussing FGM is a challenge. And a final theme we wanted to highlight is that certain aspects of traditional gender roles are beginning to shift, and fathers in particular want to be more involved as fathers. And so this may provide an important opportunity for addressing FGM. So these are just sort of, when we look at all of the different ideas that came out of the qualitative research, these three themes emerged: complicity, where men are, engaged with, supporting, and all the different reasons for that engagement and support for FGM. Then men can also dislike FGM if it interferes with their sexual relationships, or they see that it harms women women and girls whom they care about and love. And then finally, a third important dimension that is key to take forward in any recommendations is that men are so different from each other, and in terms of their age, urban, rural, their employment status, and so on. And all of these things are very important for determining what they think and what kinds of messages and actions they might respond to. So the common recommendations are, again, you've heard, I'm not going to say anything here that hasn't already come up in the findings, that it's really important to direct specific activities and messages to boys and men, and including taking into account their multiple identities and the specific subgroups who might be responsive to given messages. That it's essential to take a gender transformative approach, to be thinking about how grounded in gender roles, men's and boys' attitudes toward FGM is, and the need to address those issues and to be working toward equality. To be working across different sectors. Again, there's this overemphasis on the health sector, but there's opportunity to be thinking about other ways of talking about FGM and other sectors within which to work, and then to identify and work more with those men who reject FGM, those standout individuals who have figured out for themselves why this is not a good thing, and to build on their example. The opportunity to work to build the connections between fatherhood and FGM prevention are very important. in some settings, it's probably, relevant to work with religious leaders. One of the issues that came up is the need to be careful because it can, working with religious leaders on this topic can also sort of harden positions on the issue. It's essential to ensure that a legal framework is in place just as a backdrop to all of this work. And it's a really important area and huge opportunity is to address sexuality and couples' mutual satisfaction and happiness with each other as a reason to question FGM and to work on it. And finally, to overcome the silence that exists because of the taboo that prevents people from talking freely about FGM. So it's been a very rapid tour through the report. I encourage you to read the report. And Indrani, I hope, I can't look at the chat right now, but I hope that the link is being put into the chat. The report is it's very beautifully organized and laid out. So it's very easy to sort of zero in on the particular either country or issue or recommendation that you might be interested in. So I warmly encourage you to take a look at it. And thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to share our research.
Thank you so much, Meg and Amel, for this, not only the presentation, but the whole work that has gone on in the last, I think it's been a year since we've been on this journey of understanding more about men's perceptions, as well as to see how we can strengthen our own programming, country-specific as well as our regional work on engaging men and boys. And you would see, colleagues, that I have put the link of the programming guidance in the chat box. As Meg mentioned, we have divided them into the regional report, and you can also zoom into the country-specific programming guidance for each of the 4 countries. And I would really encourage you to have a look at it, and also please feel free to share it with your networks as well. Some of the learnings is something that you can use in your specific context as well. And as I see a question that has been raised by Sanjay, and Jose has responded to it, when we started this journey, we did specifically look at FGM as a harmful practice and how we can engage men and boys specifically, but it's a learning that we can also use for child marriage. But the reasons for lack of stronger engagement with men for FGM are very specific, and hence the messages are very specific as well. But it can be tailored for child marriage, and our hope is that we can use these learnings to also see our engagement with men on harmful practices such as child marriage as well. So just to answer to your question as well, we have only about 4 minutes before I open the floor for also closing remarks, but I would like to open the floor in case there are any questions or any comments that anyone would like to share before we close today's webinar. I don't see any hands up. Amel, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to take the opportunity to thank all the country offices, UNICEF and UNIFE in the 4 countries, because they have been very helpful to us. The comments we got from Djibouti, Sudan, Egypt office, as well as Yemen office was really very helpful. They shared with us draft reports that have been in the countries that we were able to really use its findings in drafting the reports. One comment I just want to say, and maybe it's on a programmatic level of how can we work in synergy together as like taking the model of these 3 or 4 countries, but maybe widening up on for all the countries. The countries are different levels. They're not all at the same level. And what we can do is learning from each other's experience. Like Yemen can in particular work a lot with Egypt and Sudan and learn from their experiences. So they don't start, they would probably start from where we learned, like lesson learned. So for instance, in Egypt and Sudan, we learned that it's very important not to overemphasize the medical messages, which is really happening right now in Yemen, because it's the easy way to introduce or talk about FGM, especially if it's a taboo issue. But usually that leads to either lessen the degree of the FGM or leads to the medicalization of the FGM. So for instance, this is a lesson learned for Yemen from the other countries. So working together and building synergies is very important on the programmatic level between the different practicing countries. That is just one of the things that came up in my mind, that came from the field very strongly. And then the very other thing, very importantly, it's very important to really look at FGM, not in a vertical way. So the question about early marriage, working on harmful traditional practices, working on gender power and roles is so important, because it's going to lead to the eradication of FGM. Even if you don't really talk about FGM per se, when you address gender roles, issues of sexuality, power structure, all this is very strongly linked to why in the first place we practice FGM. It will solve the dilemma between the men. I want to practice FGM because I'm sure that women will be sexually, I will curb their sexuality, I will control their sexuality, but in the same time, I don't want to practice it because I know it's going to have a bad, it will really kind of interfere with my sexual pleasure. Should really kind of working with men on deconstructing their masculinity, their understanding of women's right to bodily integrity and the enjoyment of the sexuality. It might be look as generic, but it's in the heart core of the work on FGM. So these are just things that people should really consider. And the last thing is how to work with men in their like natural habitat and or organically. Usually what's happened is we bring men to the NGO to give them lectures or raising awareness. That's not organic. Go out to the men, see where they are gathered, strike a conversation, encourage intergenerations so the younger men can be able to talk to the gatekeepers. These are all different approaches that need to be utilized in order to really pass strongly a very comprehensive and multi-layered messages on FGM. Thank you very much again. And it was a pleasure working with everybody. And I'm really was glad leading this research and working with Meg on drafting the report. It was just a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amel, and thank you for giving us these important inputs. Very critical for us to have that in mind when we develop these messages specifically for men and boys as we address FGM. But I'd really like to give the floor now to Dr. Karina, who's the Deputy Regional Director for UNFPA ASTRO, are very, very important partners in this entire process in the joint program for the joint UNICEF UNFPA program on ending FGM. Very importantly, our great relationship at the regional level and in very important work that we're doing in all the 4 countries here. But over to you, Dr. Karina, and thank you so much for taking our time today.
Sure. Thank you, Indrani, and thank you, colleagues. You know, in a way, first I want to apologize for coming in late. I was pulled out last second, literally. But I'm also happy that I was able to hear most of the webinar and be at the closing. My grandmother always said, if you want to know the end, look at the beginning. And I think the beginning has been beautiful, really, because of the joint work of UNFPA and UNICEF FGM focal point from so many regions, from ASRO, MENA, ISARO, VACARO, and both regional, country level, the joint program to end FGM HQ technical team, CSOs, partners, and of course the researchers. I mean, I was feverishly jotting notes at the closing remark, thinking, oh, we can do this and we can do that. And so, Indrani, you'll hear from us shortly with all the amazing things we could continue on this research. Because indeed, the problem is pervasive, right? And we need to tackle it from so many different angles. I mean, it continues to threaten the well-being of millions of girls. I should not be preaching to the converted, but in reality, when I hear the number 50 million women and girls living with FGM, it's a tragedy. And yes, FGM is a violation of human rights. And it is a manifestation of deep-seated gender inequality. But if we think of individuals impacted, we also need to realize the impact it has on the quality of life of each woman and girl, as the bodily autonomy is undermined and the integrity of the body. is really damaged, robbing them of opportunities for their full potential. And so, yeah, for UNFPA, the elimination of FGM is central to our mandate. In fact, it is so central that it's part of our 3 corporate transformative results, where we aim to achieve the end of gender-based violence and all harmful practices by 2030. It's an awfully tall order, I must say, but indeed, and going back again, right, we begin with partners, and together we are unstoppable. And with UNICEF in specifically, we are committed to drive forward until the abandonment of FGM. And in that pursuit, we'll continue, whether through additional research, through other work already planned, but also building on what we're talking about as we move. There was this great idea, we could have Yemen learn from Egypt, right? We could have Yemen learn from Sudan. Indeed, so, you know, it's not just the body of the work, but the branches that come from a healthy trunk of a tree of joint collaboration and thinking. And so without belaboring any further, I'd just like to say that the burden of our collective change should not fall on women and girls. We are standing with them. It's a common problem for humanity. So only together we can overcome it. And I'm truly honored to be part of this amazing team that moves it forward. One step at a time. It may not come tomorrow, but it will come because we're determined. Thank you for that. And thank you again for the amazing research that the team put together. I have a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karina. It's really encouraging to hear your voice and words on the very emphasis that we're laying since the beginning of the webinar, and also the whole conversation that started for us, which led for this programming guidance, was that the burden of change is not just on girls and women, but we need men and boys as partners in the process for change. And with this, I'd really like to thank all of you colleagues and friends for joining us today. I know 1 hour is indeed very short for a conversation like this on positive masculinities overall, and the role of men and boys in prevention of harmful practices. But we hope to continue this conversation and understanding of interventions to ensure that men and boys are truly holistically involved in our programming as we along with women and girls in the efforts to end FGM. Thank you so much for joining today, colleagues. And we will be sharing all the presentations, the links again for the programming guidance, and hope you'll find it useful, as well as share it with other partners and networks as well. Thank you so much. Have a very good day, everyone. Thank you.